The courthouse in the small Ohio town had never felt so alive with tension. On ordinary days, the old building was a place of routine hearings and minor disputes, a place where traffic tickets and property quarrels dominated the docket. But today was different. The benches were packed, reporters leaned forward with their notepads, and the quiet hum of whispers filled the air like static. Everyone had come for one reason: the trial of a man accused of terrorizing his own neighborhood. A man whose intimidating presence had left families sleepless for months. At the center of it all, seated on a long wooden bench, was the most unexpected figure of the day. A little girl, no more than 3 years old, sat with her legs swinging freely, clutching a small stuffed rabbit in one hand. She wore a pale yellow dress with tiny flowers stitched along the hem, and her hair had been tied into 2 short pigtails that bobbed when she moved. To anyone who didn't know the story, she might have looked like a visitor, waiting for her mother to finish some dull errand. But those who did know understood her role would be far greater. Beside her, lying calmly on the polished courthouse floor, was a large German shepherd with a sleek coat and alert eyes. The canine's head rested on his front paws, but his ears twitched at every sound, and his gaze swept across the room in measured intervals. He wasn't just any dog, he was a trained police canine, assigned to provide comfort and protection for vulnerable witnesses. For this little girl, he was more than that. He was her anchor, her silent shield against the storm about to unfold. From the defense table, the accused watched her with a chilling calmness. Broad-shouldered and hard-eyed, he leaned back in his chair, arms folded across his chest. The smirk curling his lips suggested he found the situation amusing. To him, the idea of a toddler being a credible witness was laughable. He had faced down police, argued with prosecutors, and stared unflinchingly at judges. Why would he worry about the words of a child barely able to spell her name? But the others in the room felt differently. The officers lining the back wall exchanged glances, their expressions grave. They had seen firsthand the way the man had instilled fear into his neighbors. They knew the little girl's testimony, however short and simple, could become the most powerful weapon the prosecution had. Innocence, when pitted against intimidation, could shine with a light too bright to ignore. The child didn't seem aware of the weight resting on her shoulders. She was fascinated by the way the light streamed in through the high windows, casting long beams across the floor. Every so often she glanced at the dog, patting his head lightly, as if to reassure herself he was still there. Her stuffed rabbit dangled loosely, already smudged from being clutched too tightly. To her, the courtroom wasn't yet a battlefield, it was just another big, echoing room filled with serious-looking people. Reporters scribbled notes, their pens racing across paper as they speculated on how the day might unfold. Some muttered under their breath that it was unfair to bring a toddler into such a setting. Others leaned forward with excitement, certain that what was about to happen would become tomorrow's headline. The idea of a courtroom, frozen by a child's words, was the kind of story that reached far beyond a small Ohio town. The judge entered with a heavy stride, his robe swishing behind him as he ascended the bench. He was an older man, stern but fair, known for running a strict courtroom. He scanned the room before rapping his gavel once, silencing the hum of chatter. Instantly, his eyes fell briefly on the little girl and the canine at her side. Though his face revealed nothing, those who knew him well could sense his unease. He understood the gravity of allowing a child so young to testify, but he also understood that justice sometimes required unconventional courage. "All rise," the bailiff called, and the room obeyed. The judge's voice carried authority as he reminded everyone of the importance of order, respect, and truth within those walls. Then, with a final glance at the lawyers seated before him, he gave the signal to begin. The prosecution wasted no time. outlining the charges with deliberate clarity. Words like terror, threats, and fear rang through the courtroom. Each phrase painted a picture of a man who had not only broken the law, but had shattered the sense of safety within his own community. As the prosecutor spoke, several families in the gallery lowered their heads, remembering the nights they had, locked their doors in dread. The defendant remained stoic, his smirk unwavering, his eyes occasionally darting toward the child. His confidence was palpable, radiating the belief that no jury would convict him based on the testimony of a 3-year-old. He adjusted his tie with slow, deliberate movements, projecting control. But those who watched the girl saw something else entirely. She sat quietly, absorbing the rhythm of the voices around her. She didn't fidget like most children her age. Instead, she leaned slightly against the canine, finding comfort in his presence. The dog remained perfectly still, his steady breathing a silent reassurance. Every so often, the girl traced her fingers along the edge of his collar, as if grounding herself in the moment. What no one could know yet was that her words, when spoken, would cut deeper than any piece of evidence any lawyers crafted, argument, or any closing statement. Her innocence would carry a kind of truth that adults often failed to deliver. The judge adjusted his glasses and glanced at the clock. Soon, he knew, the time would come to call the little girl forward. He tapped his pen against the bench thoughtfully, aware that the next hour could define not only the outcome of this trial, but the lives of everyone involved. The room seemed to hold its breath as the bailiff prepared the paperwork. Reporters leaned closer, jurors shifted slightly in their seats, and even the seasoned officers straightened in anticipation. Outside, the bells of the courthouse clock tower struck the hour, their echoes weaving through the windows like a solemn warning. And there, at the heart of it all, sat the toddler and her canine. She was too young to grasp the tension building. Around her, too innocent to realize how much depended on her voice. To her, the trial was still just a big room filled with strangers. But to everyone else, it was the beginning of a moment they would never forget, a moment when a child's words might stop a courtroom cold. The defendant sat with the composure of a man who believed the room belonged to him. His chair creaked as he leaned back, arms crossed over his broad chest, eyes narrowing into slits as he studied the little girl sitting across the courtroom. His smirk wasn't just arrogance, it was a deliberate act of intimidation. He knew she would be called to the stand. He also knew that for many adults, just being under his gaze was enough to spark discomfort. To a child, he believed that glare would be devastating. The jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats as his stare lingered. They weren't supposed to interpret body language outside of testimony, but it was impossible to ignore the way his presence dominated the room. He had the look of someone used to control, someone who thrived on power gained through fear. For months, he had succeeded in using that fear to silence neighbors and even frighten families from testifying. Yet here, in this room, his silence seemed louder than any outburst could have been. The little girl, still clutching her stuffed rabbit, seemed oblivious to the weight of his gaze. Her small fingers twirled the ear of the toy absent-mindedly, and her other hand rested gently on the head of the canine lying beside her. But the officers watching closely noticed the subtle shift. Her shoulders tensed slightly, her back pressed more firmly against the wooden bench. Children didn't always have the words to explain fear, but their bodies told the story clearly. The canine, as if tuned to her unspoken emotions, lifted his head and fixed his steady eyes on the defendant. His ears flicked forward, his muscles stiffened just enough to be noticeable. A low rumble didn't escape him, but the tension in his body was a warning all on its own. Trained for years to sense distress, the dog had already chosen his priority, the child. Whispers broke out in the gallery. Some wondered aloud how the prosecution could possibly expect a toddler to give testimony against such a hardened man. "She's too young," a woman murmured. "She won't even remember clearly." Another man shook his head. "But sometimes kids notice what adults ignore," he countered. A divide was clear. Half doubted the wisdom of putting her in that position, while others sensed her innocence might be the very key to unlocking truth. The judge cleared his throat, quieting the gallery. His stern eyes flicked toward the defendant. Though no words were spoken, the warning was evident. Intimidation had no place here. Still, the man's smirk only widened slightly, as though he found the rebuke amusing. The prosecutor, sensing the tension building, rose from his seat and addressed the court with careful precision. He reminded everyone of the charges, the threats made late at night, the menacing presence in public spaces, the way this man had cornered and terrified a young mother and her child. The prosecutor's words struck hard, each sentence layered with evidence, but he knew the most powerful moment had yet to come. His strategy was not to rely solely on documents or photographs, but on the undeniable truth spoken through the unfiltered eyes of a child. The defense attorney, polished and confident, scribbled notes and occasionally leaned toward his client. His whispers were low, but the defendant's smug nods revealed his mindset. This was nothing to fear. In his view, a toddler's testimony would collapse under even the simplest questioning. He would let her stumble, let her falter, and the jury would dismiss her words as childish imagination. But what he didn't count on was the strength of innocence when paired with courage. As the court proceedings continued, the girl glanced toward the defendant. Their eyes met her wide, uncertain gaze against his cold, unflinching stare. For a brief moment, the room seemed to still. Reporters scribbled furiously, sensing the silent clash unfolding in plain sight. A child versus a man, innocence versus menace. The little girl quickly looked away, pressing her face lightly against the canine's head. The dog remained immovable, his calm breathing a rhythm she could anchor to. Her small fingers curled into his fur, and though her lips quivered, she did not cry. That resilience alone caught the attention of the jury. Many adults, under similar scrutiny, might have broken down. Yet here she was, only 3 years old, finding strength in the steady presence of the animal beside her. From the prosecution table, an assistant whispered to the lead attorney. "She's holding up," the assistant murmured, eyes wide. The attorney nodded, his gaze fixed on the defendant. "And he hates it," he replied softly. Indeed, the defendant's confidence had shifted, though subtly. His smirk remained, but his jaw tightened. The longer the girl resisted showing fear, the more cracks appeared in his performance. For a man who thrived on control, nothing was more frustrating than being unable to break someone, especially someone so young. The judge, glancing between the two, finally gave the order that everyone had been waiting for. "Bring forward the witness." His voice echoed through the chamber. The gallery held its breath. The bailiff moved toward the little girl, kneeling down to explain gently what would happen next. She nodded slowly, still gripping her rabbit, and never letting go of the canine's reassuring presence until the last moment. The officers in the back straightened, and the reporters' pens scratched faster than ever. The defendant leaned forward now, elbows on the table, his stare following her every step as if willing her to falter. His confidence radiated still, but unease lurked beneath it, visible to those watching closely. He had underestimated her once. He would not do so again. And so the stage was set. A 3-year-old child, about to testify in one of the most tense trials the town had ever seen, would stand against the man who had terrified her. The canine, sitting back on his haunches near the stand, remained ready, silent, protective, and immovable. What the defendant didn't know was that in the moments to come, his carefully built shield of intimidation would begin to crack. And it wouldn't be because of an experienced prosecutor or a polished argument, but because of a toddler who refused to break under his gaze. The courtroom, already buzzing with tension, leaned collectively forward. Everyone knew something extraordinary was about to happen. The courtroom fell into a charged silence as the bailiff carefully guided the toddler toward the witness stand. Her tiny shoes tapped softly against the wooden floor, each step echoing far louder than expected in the hushed chamber. The stuffed rabbit dangled from her hand, swinging slightly with her unsteady movements. The K9 followed close, his eyes locked ahead, every muscle tight with vigilance. It wasn't unusual for him to accompany vulnerable witnesses, but today his presence felt almost symbolic, like a guardian angel in fur, ensuring the smallest voice in the room would not be silenced. The judge leaned forward, his expression more solemn than usual. He was a man who had presided over countless testimonies, but never one from a child this young. He reminded himself that the oath had to be adjusted for her age, simplified to words she could understand. Leaning down slightly, he spoke gently. "Do you promise to tell the truth about what you remember, even if it's scary?" The girl nodded, her pigtails bobbing, and whispered, "Yes." Her voice was so soft that the clerk had to adjust the microphone downward until it nearly brushed her chin. A wave of murmurs rippled across the gallery before being silenced by a sharp rap of the judge's gavel. The prosecutor rose slowly, careful not to appear intimidating. His tone was calm, measured, as though speaking to his own child at home. "Can you tell us your name?" he asked gently. The girl blinked at him, clutching her rabbit tighter. "Lily," she said, her voice clearer this time. "And how old are you, Lily?" She held up 3 fingers, her lips forming the word 3. The jury chuckled softly, not at her, but at the undeniable sweetness of the gesture. Even the judge's stern mouth twitched, though he quickly composed himself. The prosecutor crouched slightly, lowering himself to her level. "Do you remember the night you and your mommy saw that man?" He pointed carefully, making sure not to gesture too aggressively toward the defendant. Lily's eyes flickered to the accused, then darted quickly back to the prosecutor. She fidgeted with the ear of her stuffed rabbit. For a moment, it seemed she might refuse to speak, but then her small hand dropped to the K9's head, stroking the familiar fur. That one touch steadied her, as if the dog's presence unlocked her courage. "Yes," she whispered. The prosecutor gave her a small, encouraging smile. "Can you tell us what you remember? Just tell us like you're telling a story." The courtroom leaned in collectively. Reporters' pens hovered, jurors froze mid-breath, and even the defendant tilted slightly forward, his smirk fading at the edges. Lily's little brow furrowed as she tried to piece her memory into words. "We were walking home. Mommy was holding my hand. Then the man was there." Her tiny hand lifted, pointing slowly toward the defendant. The gallery gasped audibly. Her voice wavered, but she continued. "He was big. He said mean things. Mommy told him to go away, but he didn't. He got closer, and Mommy held me tight." Her hand curled into a fist, clutching her rabbit with white knuckles. "I was scared. Mommy was scared too." The words, simple as they were, struck with the force of a hammer. No amount of legal argument could dilute the raw image of a frightened mother and child, cornered by the defendant. Jurors shifted in their seats, their expressions hardening. The prosecutor nodded softly. "Did anything happen after that?" Lily's lips trembled. She glanced down at the K9, then whispered, "The dog came." Her voice grew firmer, almost proud. "He barked loud." The man stopped. "Mommy said we were safe because the dog was there." She pressed her cheek against the microphone accidentally, her voice amplified in a way that made even the defendant flinch. "He saved us." The K9 didn't move, his stoic presence amplifying her words without a single sound. The prosecutor glanced at the jury, letting the silence stretch just enough for the weight of her testimony to sink in. Then he asked gently, "Do you remember how you felt?" Her eyes filled with tears, though she didn't cry. "I was scared," she admitted, her tiny shoulders hunching. "But I wasn't scared when the dog came. He made the bad man go away." For a moment, the room froze. Even the reporters, trained to stay detached, seemed shaken by the honesty in her words. The prosecutor stood, smoothing his tie, and said, "No further questions at this time." His voice carried a quiet confidence. He knew what the jury had just heard wasn't just testimony. It was truth delivered with the kind of purity no adult could replicate. The judge nodded, turning toward the defense. "Cross-examination?" The defense attorney rose, adjusting his suit jacket with deliberate slowness. His smile was polite, but his eyes were sharp. He believed he could unravel her, make her words seem less credible. To him, she was just a child repeating half-remembered fears. He didn't realize yet that he was about to step into the most dangerous moment of the trial. Lily shifted uneasily as the defense attorney approached, his footsteps echoing heavily against the wooden floor. The canine lifted his head, watching him with hawk-like focus. The air thickened with anticipation. Before a single question was asked, the tension had already reset the battlefield. The defendant leaned forward again, hoping intimidation would finally break her. But Lily's hand never left the canine's head. With every stroke of fur, her courage seemed to grow. The courtroom knew what was coming, the clash of innocence and manipulation. And though the defense attorney didn't yet know it, his strategy was about to backfire spectacularly. The defense attorney rose with the poise of a man who believed he had full command of the room. His suit was perfectly pressed, his tie knotted with precision, and his polished shoes clicked deliberately against the floor as he approached the stand. He adjusted his cufflinks, as though even the smallest detail of his appearance would add weight to his words. His strategy was clear: dismantle the child's testimony, not through aggression, but through carefully placed doubt. "Good morning, Lily," he began, lowering his voice to a falsely gentle tone. "You're very brave to be here today." Lily clutched her stuffed rabbit tighter, saying nothing. Her wide eyes flicked to the canine, who had sat upright the moment the attorney moved closer. The dog's ears pricked forward, his gaze fixed on the man as though measuring each step, each movement. The attorney smiled, though the corners of his eyes betrayed calculation rather than kindness. "Now, Lily," he said, tilting his head as if speaking to a niece. "Sometimes, when we're very young, we think we see things that maybe aren't quite right. Do you ever get scared of shadows in your room at night?" The courtroom stiffened. Jurors exchanged glances, clearly uneasy with a line of questioning. The prosecutor leaned forward, ready to object if necessary. Lily frowned. "Sometimes," she whispered. The defense attorney nodded knowingly. "Of course, we all do. And sometimes, when we're scared, our imagination can make things seem worse than they are. Do you understand?" This time she shook her head firmly. He was real. Her tiny hand lifted and pointed again, this time more confidently, toward the defendant. The man at the table shifted uncomfortably. The attorney's smile faltered, but he pressed on. "But you're very little, aren't you? Only 3 years old. That's very young to remember things clearly. Maybe your mommy told you about what happened, and that's why you think you remember?" The prosecutor was on his feet instantly. "Objection. Leading the witness, Your Honor." The judge considered for a moment and nodded. "Sustained. Counsel, rephrase your question." The defense attorney swallowed irritation, but he quickly adjusted his tone. "Lily, can you tell me, did anyone talk to you about this before today? Did Mommy or the nice police officers tell you what to say?" The child's eyes widened slightly, her face flushing with the pressure. For a moment, silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. The defense attorney smirked, convinced she was about to crumble. Then it happened. The K-9, sensing her distress, let out a low, resonant growl that rolled through the courtroom like distant thunder. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. Every head turned. The defense attorney froze mid-step, his confidence faltering as he glanced down at the dog. The judge's gavel came down sharply. "Order in the court," he barked. "Control." "At animal," but the handler quickly stepped forward. "Your Honor, the K-9 is trained to respond to distress. He's not acting aggressively, only protectively." All eyes returned to Lily. She hadn't flinched. In fact, she seemed steadier than before, her small fingers buried in the dog's fur. Her gaze turned toward the defense attorney, her expression firmer now. "No one told me what to say," she said, her voice clearer than it had been all. I remember because I was scared. He scared my mommy. And me." The courtroom erupted with murmurs. Jurors leaned forward, their eyes locked on her. Even the judge appeared momentarily taken aback by the sudden burst of conviction from someone so young. The gavel struck again for silence, but the impression lingered. This wasn't a coached child repeating memorized words. This was raw memory, delivered without hesitation. The defense attorney swallowed hard, his polished facade cracking. He shifted tactics quickly, trying to regain control. "Lily, are you sure it wasn't just a man you didn't know? Sometimes strangers can seem scary." Her little chin lifted, defiant in its own way. "No, it was him." Again, her finger pointed directly at the defendant. The simplicity of the statement struck harder than any rehearsed accusation. The defendant shifted in his chair, his smirk now gone. His eyes darted briefly to the jury before settling back on the girl. "4." The first time, unease shadowed his face. The K-9 remained poised beside her, silent now, but his earlier growl had changed the atmosphere entirely. The defense attorney was no longer in command of the room. The jurors' eyes had softened toward the child, hardened toward the defendant, and grown skeptical of the man trying to undermine her. The attorney's questions grew weaker. Each attempt to twist her words only seemed to reinforce her honesty. When he asked if she was sure about what she remembered, she repeated, "Yes, I'm sure." When he pressed about shadows and dreams, she shook her head. It wasn't a dream. It was real. "He was mean," Mommy cried. Her words, though small, cut deeper than the sharpest legal argument. Finally, after stumbling through a few more ineffective questions, the defense attorney realized he was losing ground with every syllable. His shoulders slumped slightly as he muttered, "No further questions." The judge nodded gravely. "The witness may step down." As Lily slid carefully from the chair, guided by the bailiff, the K-9 stood and walked proudly at her side. The courtroom watched in silence, every eye following the pair as they made their way back to the bench. Reporters scribbled furiously, knowing the moment they had just witnessed would dominate tomorrow's headlines. The prosecutor leaned back in his chair, a quiet smile crossing his face. The defense had attempted to dismantle the child's words, but instead, he had solidified them. What should have been her most vulnerable moment had become her strongest. And the jury had seen it all. The defendant clenched his fists beneath the table, his jaw tight. He had counted on fear to silence her, but she had spoken anyway. He had counted on intimidation to weaken her, but she had pointed at him without hesitation. The fortress of arrogance he had built around himself was beginning to crack, and it had been done not by seasoned prosecutors, not by officers or lawyers, but by a toddler with a stuffed rabbit and a loyal dog. The courtroom settled once more, but the air was different now. Something had shifted, and everyone knew it. The courtroom had just begun to settle after the defense's failed attempt at discrediting Lily. A hush lingered, punctuated only by the faint shuffle of papers and the squeak of a juror's chair. The judge leaned back, adjusting his glasses, clearly preparing to call the next witness. But before he could speak, Lily tugged at the sleeve of the bailiff, guiding her back to the bench. "I have to say something," she whispered. The bailiff hesitated. It wasn't protocol for a child to interrupt proceedings, especially after testimony. He bent down, listening closer. "What is it, sweetheart?" Her little voice trembled, but carried weight. "I didn't tell them everything." The bailiff's eyes widened. He glanced toward the judge, unsure of what to do. The judge, noticing the hesitation, rapped his gavel. "Is there a matter that needs addressing?" The bailiff straightened, his face serious. "Your Honor, the witness has indicated she wishes to add something." A ripple of surprise passed through the courtroom. Murmurs erupted, reporters' pens scratching furiously, defense and prosecution alike stiffening. The judge's brow furrowed. "Bring her forward again," he ordered. Lily returned to the stand, clutching her stuffed rabbit in one hand, her other resting on the fur of the canine, who had refused to leave her side. His calm presence gave her strength. "Lily," the judge said gently, "you said you had something more to share. You understand you're still under oath?" She nodded, her tiny pigtails bobbing. "Yes." The prosecutor leaned forward, curiosity in his eyes, while the defense attorney shifted uneasily in his seat, sensing danger. The courtroom fell into a silence so deep that even the sound of the air conditioner seemed absent. Every gaze fixed on the little girl in the witness chair. Her eyes, round and glassy, looked straight at the defendant. "He told me not to talk," she said. The words dropped like a stone into water, sending invisible ripples across the courtroom. Jurors stiffened. The prosecutor froze, and even the defendant's own attorney paled. Lily clutched her rabbit tighter, her knuckles white. "He came close to me that night. He bent down, right by my ear. He said if I told anyone, he would hurt Mommy, and me." The canine stirred, pressing closer to her side as though sensing the rise of fear inside her. Gasps spread across the courtroom. The judge slammed his gavel. "Order! Order!" But even his commanding tone could not erase the weight of what had just been spoken. The prosecutor was on his feet in an instant. "Your Honor, let the record reflect that the witness has testified to direct threats made by the defendant." His voice was sharp, carrying the gravity of the revelation. The defense attorney stammered, scrambling to rise. "Objection, Your Honor. This is highly prejudicial." The judge cut him off, his face stern. "Overruled. The jury will consider the testimony." His gaze shifted toward the child, softening. "Go on, Lily. You're doing very well." She swallowed, her lower lip trembling, but her voice grew steadier. "I was so scared. I didn't sleep. I hugged Bunny all night. And then the nice dog came." She turned her head toward the canine, eyes shining. "He stayed with me. He made me feel safe. So I told the police, because I knew the dog wouldn't let him hurt us anymore." The jurors leaned forward, captivated. Tears welled in the eyes of one older woman, who dabbed at her cheeks with a tissue. Another juror, a father himself, clenched his jaw clearly, holding back emotion. The defense attorney fumbled with his notes, his polished composure gone. His client, the defendant, shifted uncomfortably, his face tightening into a scowl. His eyes darted nervously toward the jury, then toward the child, as though he wished he could will her words away. But the damage was done. For the first time, the courtroom had heard not only the child's account of what happened, but also the terror the defendant had instilled in her. Threats against a child carried a weight no legal maneuver could easily undo. It was more than evidence. It was raw, human truth. The silence that followed was profound. Even the scratch of reporters' pens had stopped. No one moved. No one breathed. The judge finally broke the stillness. His voice was solemn, almost reverent. "Thank you, Lily. Your bravery is noted." She looked down at her rabbit, whispering, "I wasn't brave." He was. Her tiny hand stroked the canine's fur. That single statement, pure, innocent, and uncoached, struck harder than any lawyer's argument. The room seemed to freeze, as though time itself had paused to absorb the meaning. The canine remained still, regal in his posture, as though he understood his role in this drama. His quiet presence reminded everyone that he was more than a police tool. He was a guardian, a protector who had given this child the courage to speak against fear itself. The prosecutor's chest swelled with renewed determination. He knew that the jury had just heard the most damning testimony of the entire trial. No forensic detail, no legal citation, no expert witness could compete with the raw honesty of a child, revealing the threat that had haunted her nights. Meanwhile, the defense attorney sat in silence, his carefully constructed arguments crumbling. His strategy of painting the child's words as confused imagination was now worthless. She had spoken of threats no child would invent, threats chilling in their specificity. The jurors sat frozen, their faces etched with shock, anger, and sorrow. Some avoided looking at the defendant altogether. Others glared openly at him, as if already weighing their verdict in their minds. The defendant leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight, his arrogance faltering. He no longer looked untouchable. He looked exposed. The judge cleared his throat. "Court will recess for 15 minutes. As his gavel struck, the spell broke. Reporters surged for the doors, eager to be the first to release the words that would define the trial. Jurors exchanged glances, heavy with unspoken judgment. The prosecutor exhaled deeply, his gaze flicking to Lily with admiration. Lily was lifted gently from the stand by the bailiff, the canine padding proudly beside her. As she passed the jury box, one juror whispered, almost inaudibly, "Brave little girl." The phrase seemed to echo in the minds of everyone present, for in that moment it was no longer just a trial. It was a story of fear, courage, and the unbreakable bond between innocence and protection. And though the law would ultimately decide the verdict, the jury had already been frozen by a child's truth. The echo of the judge's gavel still seemed to linger long after the courtroom had emptied for recess. Outside the heavy oak doors, chaos erupted. Reporters jostled against each other, microphones and cameras flashing as they clamored to deliver. Breaking updates. Headlines were practically writing themselves. Toddler reveals threats in court. Canine gives child courage to speak. Defendant shaken by shocking testimony. Inside the courthouse lobby, spectators murmured in disbelief. Conversations overlapped. Strangers recounted the same words, as if repeating them could help them grasp their weight. "He told me not to talk. He would hurt Mommy." Those phrases rolled off tongues like lines carved into stone, unforgettable and chilling. Meanwhile, in the quiet sanctuary of a side room, Lily sat curled in a chair, clutching her stuffed rabbit tightly. The canine lay at her feet, his head resting on his. Pause, his calm eyes watching the little girl as though keeping guard even now. The bailiff crouched beside her, offering a small smile. "You did so well in there," he said softly. She looked up, her voice no louder than a whisper. "Will he still hurt us?" The bailiff shook his head firmly. "Not while we're here. Not while he's here," he added, motioning to the canine. That reassurance seemed to sink in. Lily leaned forward, burying her face into the dog's fur, drawing comfort from the warmth of the animal who had already become her silent hero. Across the hall, the prosecution team gathered in a tight circle. The lead prosecutor, Daniel Marks, rubbed his temple, his voice low but resolute. "That testimony changes everything. We now have direct evidence of intimidation. It cements motive, fear, and intent. His colleague nodded. The jury heard her truth, and the defense knows they can't spin it away. But Daniel wasn't celebrating yet. He'd been in enough courtrooms to know that even the strongest moments needed follow-through. "We need to secure corroboration," he said. "Let's see if there's any record, notes, neighbors, anything that could align with what you just said." While the prosecution recalibrated their case, the defense team scrambled like a ship taking on water. Their lead attorney, Jonathan Keller, paced the length of the defense table in their private consultation room, his voice sharp and clipped. "This is catastrophic. A child's words like that? The jury will remember it forever." His co-counsel tried to interject. "We can challenge credibility." "Credibility?" Keller snapped, his frustration boiling. "She's 5 years old. No juror will believe she fabricated a threat like that." He rubbed his forehead, knowing full well their options were narrowing to desperation. "We need to find some angle. Discredit the dog. Argue coaching. Something." But deep down, Keller knew it was useless. The child's testimony hadn't been rehearsed. Her words had spilled out unpolished, trembling but painfully real. It was the kind of truth jurors carried into deliberations, like a weight they couldn't set down. Back in the courtroom, as the recess neared its end, the jury returned to their seats. They looked different now, heavier somehow, as though burdened by what they'd heard. Some avoided looking at the defendant entirely. Others fixed him with stony stares, their sympathy clearly resting with the little girl who had faced him with words more powerful than any evidence shown so far. The bailiff announced, "All rise." The judge entered, his face solemn. He adjusted his robe before speaking. "Court is now back in session." The prosecutor wasted no time. "Your Honor," Daniel Marks began, "in light of the witnesses. Additional testimony. The state requests to call Detective Harper, who was present during the initial disclosure made by the child." The defense attorney rose slowly, trying to mask his unease. "Objection, Your Honor. This is piling on emotional testimony." "Overruled," the judge said without hesitation. Detective Harper took the stand, a seasoned officer with graying hair and steady eyes. He described the night Lily had first spoken, her trembling voice, her hesitation before finally revealing the words that had just echoed again in court. "She was holding on to the canine when she told us," Harper recalled. "It was clear he gave her the courage she needed." The jury listened, every detail reinforcing the authenticity of Lily's words. Meanwhile, the defendant sat rigid. His jaw clenched, his once confident demeanor had cracked. Each retelling of his threat drove the nail deeper, and though he tried to mask his reaction, sweat beaded at his temple. By late afternoon, the courtroom had absorbed hours of additional testimony and evidence. But no matter what else was said, the focus remained on Lily's words. Even the journalists in the gallery seemed less concerned with legal intricacies and more captivated by the human drama unfolding before them. When court adjourned for the day, the courthouse steps became a frenzy. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward, reporters shouting over one another. "Mr. Marks, do you believe the defendant will still walk free? What does today mean for your case?" Daniel Marks raised his hand, silencing them momentarily. His words were deliberate. "Today, you all heard a voice that should never have needed to speak in a courtroom. That voice belongs to a child, and it carried the truth. We will not let that truth be buried." Across the plaza, the defense attorneys pushed their client quickly into a waiting car, avoiding the barrage of questions. Shouts followed them down the street. "How do you respond to the child's testimony? Do you still claim innocence?" In a quieter corner, away from the chaos, Lily's mother held her daughter close. Tears stained her cheeks, but there was pride in her eyes. "You were so brave today," she whispered into Lily's hair. Lily only shook her head. "I wasn't brave," she repeated, the same words she had spoken in court. She glanced down at the canine, who walked loyally beside them, his tail swishing gently. He was brave for me. That simple statement struck her mother deeply. She kissed her daughter's forehead, whispering, "Maybe you are both brave." As the sun dipped low over the courthouse, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, the city buzzed with the day's revelations. Television anchors prepared their evening broadcasts. Jurors went home with heavy thoughts, and attorneys readied for the battle still to come. But for many, one moment replayed again and again in their minds. The voice of a child, trembling but unyielding, breaking a silence with words that froze a room and reshaped a trial. The battle wasn't over, but the tide had turned. And in the heart of it all, a little girl and a loyal canine stood as living proof that even in the coldest chambers of justice, courage could find a voice. The next morning, the courthouse carried a different kind of tension. The air was thick, expectant, as though everyone knew the trial had crossed into its final chapter. Jurors walked in with solemn expressions, aware that what they would soon decide could alter lives forever. Spectators lined the benches early, whispering predictions, while reporters set up outside, their cameras already rolling. Inside, the defendant sat stiffly, his suit pressed, but his face drawn. His eyes darted around the room, but he avoided the jury's gaze. His defense team clustered beside him, papers spread across the table, their whispered arguments sharp and frantic. They knew they had little left. Judge Harrison called the court to order, his gavel echoing against the paneled walls. "We will proceed with closing arguments today," he announced, his voice calm but carrying weight. "Counsel, you may begin." The defense had requested to go first. Jonathan Keller rose, buttoning his jacket with a practiced composure that barely concealed his anxiety. He faced the jury, his tone measured, almost pleading. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case has stirred emotions," he began. "We've heard powerful words from a child. But we must remember, emotion is not evidence. A child's memory is fragile, impressionable. Could she have been influenced? Could her words have been misunderstood?" He paced slowly, hands outstretched. "The state wants you to convict based on sympathy. But sympathy is not justice." He leaned closer, his voice dropping as though confiding in them. "Ask yourselves, where is the hard evidence? Where are the facts that prove, beyond reasonable doubt, that my client is guilty? Without that, you cannot convict." Keller's words hung in the air. He was skilled, practiced, but something in his delivery faltered. The jury shifted uneasily. They had heard the child's trembling words. They had seen her clutch the canine for courage. Facts mattered, yes, but truth had a way of cutting deeper than evidence on paper. When Keller sat down, there was no applause, no relief in his client's expression. Only silence, heavy and uncertain. Then Daniel Marks rose for the prosecution, carrying with him the weight of the child's voice and the responsibility of truth. He walked to the center of the courtroom, meeting the jurors' eyes one by one. His voice was steady, resonant. "You have heard a great deal over these past weeks. Evidence, testimonies, arguments. But yesterday, you heard something different. You heard the truth spoken by the smallest voice in this room." He paused, letting silence frame his words. "A child told you, without hesitation, what the defendant threatened. Those words were not coached. They were not imagined. They were real. You saw it in her face. You heard it in her trembling tone. And you felt it, just as I did, in the silence that followed." He paced slowly, his voice gaining momentum. "The defense asks for evidence. But what greater evidence is there than the victim's own words?" Fear etched into her voice. courage drawn only from the comfort of a canine at her side. That moment revealed more truth than any photograph or document ever could. He turned to the jury fully now, his gaze unwavering. This case is not about sympathy. It is about accountability. It is about ensuring that no child lives in fear, that no threats go unanswered, that justice is not silenced by intimidation. The courtroom was still, every word sinking into the hearts of those listening. Marks continued, his tone rising like a tide. When you deliberate, remember her words. Remember the way this defendant sat as she spoke, unable to look at her. Remember the silence that filled this room, because silence speaks louder than denial. He let his final words land like a gavel. Justice demands that you convict. Justice demands that her voice be heard. When Marks returned to his seat, the room seemed to exhale. Even the defense attorneys sat in uneasy quiet, their notes untouched, their earlier bravado drained. The jurors' faces were grave, thoughtful, carrying the weight of both arguments, but leaning toward a decision that had already begun to crystallize in their hearts. Judge Harrison gave his final instructions carefully, his voice guiding the jurors through the process of deliberation. You must consider only the evidence presented in this court. You must be unanimous in your decision. And you must weigh the testimony with the same measure as any other evidence, without prejudice or emotion clouding your judgment. With that, the jury was dismissed to deliberate. The hours that followed were tense. Families huddled together in the gallery. The defendant sat rigid, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles whitened. His attorneys whispered strategies for appeals, though their words sounded hollow, rehearsed. On the opposite side, Lily's mother sat quietly with her daughter on her lap, the canine resting loyally at their feet. Reporters camped outside, their live updates broadcasting to every home and office in the city. The jury is deliberating after one of the most emotionally charged trials in recent memory, one anchor announced. The words of a 5-year-old child delivered in open court may very well decide the outcome. Inside the jury room, 12 men and women sat in tense discussion. Some voiced the defense's concerns. Was it possible the child misunderstood? But others countered quickly, pointing to the authenticity of her fear, the corroborating testimony of Detective Harper, the clear pattern of intimidation. Slowly, steadily, the room leaned toward agreement. Back in the courtroom, hours stretched. Into evening, the judge returned to his chambers. Attorneys waited in silence, their nerves fraying. Lily dozed in her mother's arms, her small chest rising and falling peacefully, unaware of the storm still raging around her. The canine never stirred, his eyes fixed on the doors as if he knew something important was coming. At last, a buzzer rang. The jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled again, everyone rising as Judge Harrison returned. The jurors filed in, faces unreadable. The foreperson clutched a folded slip of paper, their hand steady but pale. Madam Foreperson, the judge said, his voice low but resonant. Has the jury reached a unanimous verdict? We have, Your Honor, came the reply. The paper was passed to the bailiff, then to the judge. He unfolded it slowly, scanning the words before handing it back. His expression gave nothing away. In the matter of the people versus the defendant, the judge intoned, the jury finds. The words that followed would decide everything. The courtroom was so silent, it seemed even the walls were holding their breath. Every eye was fixed on the jury foreperson, who now stood holding the slip of paper. The defendant sat forward, his jaw tight, eyes wide in anticipation of freedom, or the crushing weight of judgment. Across the aisle, Lily's mother clutched her daughter closer, whispering prayers under her breath. Detective Harper rested a protective hand on the canine's collar, sensing the storm about to break. The foreperson cleared their throat, unfolding the paper with deliberate care. Their voice was steady, though the words trembled with significance. On the charge of intimidation of a child witness, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. For a moment, no one moved. Then the silence shattered. Gasps erupted from the gallery. The defendant slumped back in his chair, eyes closing, as if the ground beneath him had collapsed. His attorneys exchanged looks of resignation, their carefully built defense undone by a child's courage. Lily's mother let out a sob of relief, burying her face in her daughter's hair. Lily, though too young to understand the full weight of the moment, smiled faintly, her small hands gripping the fur of the K9, who had never left her side. The dog leaned into her touch, steady and calm, as though he had known all along what justice would bring. Judge Harrison's gavel struck twice, restoring order. "Quiet in the court," he commanded. His eyes swept across the room, lingering briefly on Lily before softening. "The defendant will be remanded into custody pending sentencing. This court thanks the jury for their service." The jurors filed out, their faces etched with the heaviness of what they had decided. Some looked toward Lily with faint smiles, subtle acknowledgments of the bravery they had witnessed. One juror even dabbed their eyes discreetly, unable to forget the sound of her small voice echoing through the chamber. Outside, news cameras caught the flood of reactions. Reporters spoke in urgent tones. Microphones pointed at anyone willing to talk. "A stunning conclusion to a case that has gripped the nation," one anchor declared. A toddler's words, spoken to a police K9, have left a courtroom and indeed the country frozen with awe. Inside, as the room emptied, Daniel Marks approached Lily and her mother. He knelt beside them, his usually composed expression softened with emotion. "You were so brave," he said gently, addressing the little girl. "Your voice made all the difference." Lily, shy and tired, whispered back, "He listened to me," nodding toward the K9. Her words were simple, but they carried a truth deeper than any legal argument. Detective Harper crouched down, scratching the K9 behind the ears. "He always does," Harper replied, his voice low but proud. The bond between the child and the dog had transcended mere companionship. It had become the lifeline that carried her truth into the world. As the family left the courtroom under the escort of officers, people in the gallery rose to their feet. It was not the chaotic cheer of victory, but a quiet, respectful applause, a recognition of courage, of innocence defended, of justice served. Lily's mother clutched her daughter tightly, overwhelmed by the wave of support. That night, news outlets replayed the footage endlessly. The image of a toddler clutching a police K9 in the courtroom became iconic, a symbol of courage in the face of fear. Editorials praised the sensitivity of the court, the wisdom of the jury, and the unshakable bond between humans and their canine guardians. Across the country, people spoke about it not just as a trial, but as a testament to resilience. In the weeks that followed, the defendant received his sentence years behind bars, with no chance of intimidating another child again. His name faded from headlines, replaced instead with stories of Lily's bravery and the loyal K9 who helped her stand tall. For Lily, life slowly began to regain its rhythm. There were nightmares still, moments when shadows loomed too large. But with therapy, the love of her mother, and visits from Detective Harper and the K9, she learned that fear could be faced and silence could be broken. Each day, her laughter returned a little stronger, her spirit shining brighter. One afternoon, months later, Lily's mother took her to the precinct. Officers gathered around, smiling, as the little girl ran straight into the arms of her furry protector. The K9 wagged his tail, bowing his head for her embrace. Cameras weren't there this time, nor reporters, only the quiet joy of a reunion. Between a child and the one who had helped her speak her truth, Harper watched, his chest swelling with pride. "You saved us all, kiddo," he murmured, though Lily was too busy giggling to hear. In her innocence, she did not grasp the full impact of her actions. But everyone around her knew that she had done what few adults could stand against fear with only honesty and courage. The story of the toddler and the K9 became a touchstone for courtroom advocates across the nation. Legal workshops cited it as proof that children, with the right support, could give powerful testimony. Police departments highlighted it as a reminder of the crucial role K9s played not just in chasing criminals, but in healing hearts. For Lily, however, it was never about fame. It was about the simple trust she had placed in a friend with fur and kind eyes. Trust that had carried her through the scariest moment of her life. Trust that had reminded the world that even the smallest voices, when heard, could shake the foundations of power. And so, the final memory of that trial was not the gavel striking, nor the verdict read aloud. It was the image of a little girl, sitting with her arms wrapped around a dog, whispering words that froze a courtroom and melted every heart within it. Justice had spoken, but it was a child who gave it a voice.